I'm Carine McCandless. I'm the author of The Wild Truth. I want to thank you all for the important work that you do, and I appreciate the opportunity to take a little time today to share with you some of my experiences in working with students. I've learned throughout my 43 years that every day, every one of us is both a teacher and a student, leading by example and learning from those around us. In education, that's an ever-evolving puzzle. It's our job to teach our students, but we also have to motivate them to educate themselves. Getting new college students to have to manage this enigma of transition with a few missing pieces that they've been programmed to rely on can sometimes be challenging. First, you've got helicopter parents. They don't realize as they hover that they're preventing their kids from rising to their own challenges. Next are schedules. Many students come from a strict program of sports or other extracurricular activities that's had them on autopilot since grade school. Now they're responsible for managing their own time. The most prominent piece missing is friends. A new school, a new town leads to peer pressure and feeling a need to conform in order to belong. That gets confusing at an age where you naturally start searching for your own identity. And of course, they've had standardized tests telling them how to learn. So for many college students, it's their first opportunity to stop being told who they are and figure it out for themselves. FYEs are a great start to this endeavor. A successful program engages students at that age when they're deciding who they want to be, and they begin to lay the foundation for who they truly will become. For almost 20 years, many FYEs have used Into the Wild as their common read, and its standard curriculum in thousands of high schools across the US. So for many new college students, it's at least their second time reading the book. Into the Wild is a powerful, true story that follows a young man on extreme adventures across North America. It's a great example of how students learn better from narratives than from lectures. I spoke often with John Krakauer while he was writing it, because he wanted my personal insight about the book's protagonist, my brother, Carine McCandless. Into the Wild studies Chris's final trek on foot into the wilderness of Alaska, where he unfortunately loses his life. He was only 24 years old. His final days were spent in an abandoned bus on a trail more than 20 miles from the nearest road. The mystique surrounding his journey provides ample matter for class discussions and essays. They don't focus on the fact that he died. They focus on the fact that he truly lived. In 2007, Sean Penn's stunning film version of the book was released. I worked as a contributing writer for the narrative of the film. It was a project that honored Chris, but the mysteries about his decisions remained private. I had yet to learn that what mattered most to Chris, absolute truth, would do the most good. Several years ago, I finally started accepting invitations to speak at schools where Into the Wild was required reading. At each visit, I received the same questions, and I became more comfortable talking openly about the truth behind the reasons for Chris's journey. Until that time, I'd mostly stayed behind the scenes, and I didn't speak often about an important part of my identity, being the little sister of Carine McCandless. The main parts of my very busy life, running a business and being a mom, had nothing to do with that role. But working with students made me open up, and the voice that accompanied that part of my identity grew louder. In the fall of 2011, Into the Wild was the FYE book of choice at Virginia Wesleyan College. I was asked to give the commencement address. For the first time, I spoke publicly to a large group about the issues of domestic violence that plagued our childhood, the devastating effects of which were compounded by constant lies, manipulations, and threats. The disclosure was brief. It wasn't the main focus of my presentation to the students by any means, but I soon learned how significant it was to them. Since I lived close to VWC, I worked with a few classes throughout the semester, answering their questions about the parts of Chris's story our story, that until then had remained untold. Having complete answers was essential to the students. Providing the missing pieces enabled them to connect with Chris beyond the literary legend that he had become. It was then that I understood that the greatest lessons come from what makes people human, not from what makes them iconic. I witnessed firsthand the incredible impact knowing the rest of the story had on the students. It became more than just an assignment to them. Regardless of whether they admired or admonished Chris, it got them to take a closer look at the world around them, at their own families, and at themselves. What would they have done in his position? More importantly, what are they going to do from their position? These extra classes were being conducted by Dr. Doug Kennedy, a favorite professor among students. I noticed how the teens always seemed attentive yet relaxed in Doug's classes, and I remember hearing them talk about how cool it was that he really seemed to get them. Doug had already been teaching Into the Wild to students for well over a decade. I remember sitting in his office on many afternoons in our animated discussions about the experience reading the book along with my added perspective hat on the students. And I found it wasn't just at Wesleyan. It was with every high school and college I went to. I began to speak up for domestic violence prevention at churches and community groups. There was no way to share my story and all that I had learned without including who had been my favorite teacher. After all, most of Chris's life was nearly the first half of my own. I started to receive letters from young people and their parents, telling me how sharing my story had affected them in a positive way. I had educators telling me the new information was teaching the way that they taught Into the Wild, changing the way. I began to understand that I had something very important to share, and I was finally ready to share it with as many people as possible. I was constantly journaling about my experiences, and when I called John to tell him I was thinking about writing a book, he encouraged me, and he agreed to write the foreword. These were the experiences that were the origin for The Wild Truth. It focuses not only on the beauty of Chris's life and all that he had to overcome that beauty, but more so on all that he had to learn from it, what I learned from him. Important lessons about honesty, knowing my own truth and my own worth, finding my voice, learning to accept my mistakes and take responsibility for their consequences, something that we often learn by observing others. From an age when we were too young to know any better, our parents told Chris and I that the problems that existed in our home were our fault. But there were those who helped us understand that the blame was not ours to keep, our 6 brothers and sisters. Same father, different mother. We learned that from knowledge came strength and the courage to talk, at least to each other, about things that were forbidden. Everyone knows there's an increased concern about physical abuse on campuses today. And it's imperative that we expand the conversation, making it more comfortable for victims to reach out for help, ultimately raising awareness so there are less victims. You can't write a memoir without talking about yourself, which can lead to an uncomfortable battle with narcissism. The balance you leave on the page is all about learning the crucial difference between selfishness and self-awareness. To be of better service to others, you first need to be of better service to yourself. Accepting yourself for who you are fully leads you to the right path where you can do the most good through work you are passionate about. Throughout the book, I illustrate how I applied these lessons as I found my way through my own college challenges, productive business endeavors, a couple destructive relationships, and most importantly, the priorities I have come to realize as a mother. Given the platform of Into the Wild and my desire to see the wild truth in classrooms to expand on these lessons, I knew that the wild truth would need to stand on its own. I had to weave through my own narrative enough of Chris's journey that John had shared so skillfully, but from my own perspective as Chris's sister. I was careful to do so in a way that would allow the 2 books to work together as companions. Now, many schools are already using both in their classrooms. Kate, a teacher in Pennsylvania, who I should probably point out I do not know, this was completely unsolicited, she writes in part, I just started teaching Into the Wild again this past year, and the wild truth allows me to see more clearly between the lines Krakauer drew in that original text. This book is a must-read for anyone who's read Into the Wild, anyone who's suffered domestic abuse, or for anyone that wants to read a story of survival, not in the wilderness, but in the midst of middle-class America. I brought with me today some sample teaching materials that Dr. Kennedy and I have created to show how the wild truth can be tailored as a common read for both an FYE program or as complete semester coursework. And we've already been using the materials ourselves with very exciting results. And Dr. Kennedy is here as well. Say hello, Doug. Also included are a couple sets of project instructions. My favorite is called What's in Your Backpack? It's an exercise that gets students to reflect on who they are as individuals while using something that's common to almost everyone on campus. Doug's favorite is the Into Your Wild project. It requires students to get outdoors solo. It takes them out of their comfort zones a bit to learn something new about themselves as they explore the area on and off campus that they now call home. And you can pick up copies of these at the signing table after the luncheon. I think that students engage with stories about people on a journey to find their true path through life because they're searching for their own. I remember what it was like trying to find that path coming out of high school. And I've come to understand the benefits if you find it early and have the guts to follow it. But students also need to be comforted by the fact that sometimes it takes a while, and it's okay to change direction a few times. This is me in May of last year on the Stampede Trail in Alaska. Another 10 miles or so down trail sits that abandoned bus where my brother spent his last few months on this earth. It took me 22 years to finally make the trek on foot. Before the hike, I had just sent the final manuscript for The Wild Truth into my publisher. The catharsis of that journey had prepared me for this one, and I was finally ready. Some of the steps on my life path involved finding my voice and speaking out, finally accepting that opening up was part of my journey to healing and to being able to help others. But it took me 2 decades. I will never know how things may have been different if someone had shown Chris and I that it was okay to speak about these things when we were coming of age. But I can see the difference it is making now. Every time I speak at a school, at least one student lingers until everyone else has gone. And they come up to me, and they talk about a burden that they've been carrying, and they ask for help for the first time. I haven't left one school where that hasn't happened. And just a few weeks ago, I received a note from a young girl in the Midwest. It's short but powerful. Dear Carine, I'm 16 years old, and domestic abuse is something that's disrupted my life every day for as long as I can remember. It's normal for me, and I have never envisioned a life without it. But I read your book, and now I do. I just wanted you to know that I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be a survivor, not a victim. Ultimately, The Wild Truth is a sibling survival story. Of Chris's 7 living brothers and sisters, 6 of us have children, and we've all broken that cycle of violence. I don't speak for them, as we have all dealt with things in our own way, and we've walked our own paths. But we all have each other to rely on, and we rally together when circumstances demand strength in numbers. Students need to feel that same strength when they're away from home. They need to feel safe and empowered. They need to feel comfortable talking about who they are and what they need. Students need reassurance that it's okay to determine their own path, their own purpose, and to not be limited to one that's been laid out before them. They will need to be passionate about their choices, to commit to moving forward even when the walking gets rough. That's what will make them successful students. That's what will make them successful when they graduate and go out into this world to lead by example, because they will be the new teachers down trail. They're the leaders and decision makers of tomorrow, the lawmakers of the future, the husbands and wives, and most importantly, the parents of our next generation. I'm very passionate about my work with students, and I'm confident that the Wild Truth can be a valuable tool to help them find their way to their path. Thank you for your time.